He had been watching her for 3 weeks before he finally decided to follow her. Not because he suspected something dangerous, not because the numbers were wrong, or the inventory was short, or any alarm had sounded in the precise, ordered machinery of his professional life. He followed her because of a photograph. A single photograph in a silver frame that he had walked past every morning for 11 years without once stopping to look at it, and then one Tuesday, for no reason he could name, he stopped. He looked. And something in the image made the floor feel less certain beneath his feet than it had ever felt before in the 42 years of his life. The woman in the photograph was younger, perhaps 30. She stood in front of a building he did not recognize, wearing a dress he had never seen her wear, holding the hand of a man whose face was turned away from the camera. She was smiling. Not the careful, contained smile she wore in his house every morning when she set his coffee on the desk and said good morning, in that quiet voice that had been part of the background of his existence for so long, he had stopped hearing it as a sound made by a person. This was a different smile entirely. The smile of someone who is completely, privately happy. The smile of someone in a life he knew nothing about. And that was when Chukwuebuka Ose Mensah, CEO of Ose Group, the largest private real estate and infrastructure company in Abuja, understood that he had employed this woman for 11 years, and did not know a single thing about her that she had not placed directly in front of him. Her name was Mama Ngozi. That was what everyone called her. The security guard at the gate, the driver, the kitchen staff, the personal assistants who came and went while she remained. Mama Ngozi. He did not know if that was her given name or a title of affection that had calcified into identity. He did not know her surname with certainty. He thought it might be Chukwu, or perhaps Chukwueke. He was not sure. If you have ever looked at someone who has been part of your daily life and realized you have been looking through them rather than at them for years, stay with me. Because what Chukwuebuka found on the night he followed Mama Ngozi home was not a theft. It was not a betrayal. It was a truth so large and so old that when it finally arrived in the light, it did not arrive quietly. She left every evening at 6 o'clock, always on time, always through the service entrance at the back of the compound, not the main gate, always with the same worn brown bag over one shoulder, and sometimes 3 or 4 times a week with a second bag, a black nylon bag, the kind you bought at the market for 50 naira, that she had not arrived with that morning. It was the second bag that had started the question. Not suspicion exactly. More like the specific discomfort of a man who has built his entire life on the principle that he notices everything and has suddenly discovered a thing he should have noticed long ago. He told no one he was going to follow her. On a Thursday evening in March, when the Abuja sky turned the particular shade of burnt orange that it only achieves in the dry season, the kind of light that makes even ordinary things look significant, Chukwuebuka left his office 40 minutes early, told his driver he would not need him, and sat in his personal car at the far end of the service road. He wore a plain grey shirt and dark trousers, no watch, no phone case that would identify him. He had never done anything like this before. He was a man who made decisions through systems and data and the structured opinions of people he paid to have good judgment. He did not follow people in the dark. And yet here he was. At 6:03, the service gate opened. Mama Ngozi walked out. She moved the way she always moved, with a steadiness that was not hurried and not slow, a specific quality of motion that belonged to someone who has been carrying things for a long time and has made peace with the weight. The brown bag was on her shoulder. The black nylon bag was in her right hand. In the fading orange light, she looked smaller outside the compound than she did inside it. Or perhaps it was simply that inside. He had never really looked. She walked to the bus stop at the end of the road. She waited. The bus came. She got on. Chukwuebuka followed in his car, keeping enough distance that she would not recognize the vehicle. He felt, uncomfortably, like a man in a film he would not have chosen to watch. But he could not turn back. The photograph in the silver frame had done something to him that he could not undo by simply choosing not to look at it. The bus went south, into areas of the city that did not appear in Osei Group's development portfolios. Not because they lacked potential, but because they lacked the kind of potential that attracted the investors his company courted. Streets where the buildings were close together and the generators ran all night and children played in the space between parked vehicles. Streets where people knew their neighbors by name because proximity made anonymity impossible. Streets that smelled of suya smoke and damp earth and the particular aliveness of places that have never been renovated into something they were not. Mama Ngozi got off at a stop near an old community center. The building had once been painted yellow. The paint had mostly surrendered to the weather, leaving streaks of original color between long gray patches. A hand-painted sign above the door read, Gidan Beg, House of Hope. She did not go inside immediately. She stood outside for a moment, reached into the brown bag, and removed something Chukwuebuka could not see clearly from the car. She looked at it briefly. Then she put it back, straightened her shoulders, and went in. He sat in the car for 4 minutes. He was aware of his own heartbeat in a way that felt unfamiliar. He got out. The door to the community center was not locked. He pushed it open quietly and found himself in a low-ceilinged corridor that smelled of cooked rice and antiseptic and something older. The smell of a building that has absorbed years of human need and has stopped apologizing for it. Voices came from a room at the end of the corridor. He walked toward them. He stood in the doorway. The room was large. Concrete floor. Fluorescent lights. About 40 people sat at long tables, men and women of various ages, some elderly, some young, a few children. At the front of the room, behind a long table covered with plates of food and covered pots, stood Mama Ngozi. She had removed her headscarf and tied it differently, casually, the way women tie their scarves when they are somewhere they do not need to perform. She was serving food. Jollof rice, fried plantain, something in a covered dish she ladled with a deep metal spoon. She was talking as she served. To an old man who held his plate with both hands, to a young woman with a child on her back, to a teenage boy who came back for a second plate and received it without comment or judgment. She knew all of them. That was immediately clear. Not as faces she had memorized, as people she had chosen. She called the old man by name. He said something that made her laugh. A real laugh, full and unguarded, nothing like the polite acknowledgement she offered in the Osei household when Chukwuebuka said something that was intended to be light. She placed an extra piece of meat on the teenage boy's plate before he asked. She touched the young woman's arm and said something quietly, and the young woman's face did a complicated thing that ended in relief. Chukwuebuka stood in the doorway and watched the woman who had made his coffee every morning for 11 years be completely, entirely herself in a room he had never known existed. And the thing that hit him hardest was not what she was doing. It was what she was feeling while she did it. He had seen Mama Ngozi every day for 11 years. He had received her service, her punctuality, her quiet competence. He had never once seen her happy. She was happy now. The black nylon bag was open on the table beside her. He could see now what it contained. Containers of food, things she had cooked, portions prepared in his kitchen, with his supplies, with his gas, in his pots, and carried here, to this room, to these people. That was the theft he had suspected. That was the crime. He stepped back from the doorway before she could see him. He walked back to the car. He sat in it for a long time, without starting the engine. It was not the food that undid him. The food was nothing, a fraction of what his household discarded in a week. It was the love, the specific, practiced, absolutely genuine quality of care he had just witnessed in that room. a quality he had never once been the recipient of from anyone in his adult life, and which he now understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, had been available in his own household for 11 years. Available, and invisible to him, because he had never once thought to look. He drove home. He did not sleep. The next morning, Mama Ngozi arrived at 6:50, as she always did. She let herself in with her key, went to the kitchen, put water on for coffee, began preparing breakfast. Chukwuebuka was already in the kitchen when she came in. She paused at the door for a fraction of a second, long enough for him to notice, short enough that she recovered it immediately. "Good morning, sir," she said, and moved toward the stove. He said, "How long have you been doing it?" She was quiet for a moment. Her back was to him. She continued moving. He said, "The community center." "How long?" She turned from the stove slowly. Her face was not afraid. It was something more complicated. The expression of someone who has been found out in an act they are not ashamed of, but had chosen to keep private, because privacy was the only control they had left. 9 years, she said. He looked at her. He said, "The food from the kitchen." She met his gaze. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why didn't you ask me?" Something moved across her face. Something old and practiced and patient. She said, "Would you have said yes?" He did not answer immediately. She turned back to the stove. That one silence was more honest than anything he had said to her in 11 years, and they both knew it. Over the following week, he watched her differently. Not with surveillance. He had finished with that. With attention. The kind of attention you give a thing you are only now understanding you have been taking for granted. He noticed how she moved through his house, as though calibrated to its rhythms. Opening windows at the exact moment the air needed changing, setting his coffee at the temperature he preferred without being told, anticipating the specific combination of documents he would need before he himself knew he would need them. He noticed that she worked 8 hours in his house, and then went directly to the community center and worked there for 2 more. He noticed that she never complained. He noticed that she never asked for anything. He noticed that he had, in 11 years, never once asked her anything. Not about her life. Not about her health. Not about the family in the photograph with the silver frame. Not about where she lived, or how she lived, or what she carried inside her beyond the quiet efficiency she brought to his mornings. He had treated her the way one treats a function, reliably present, reliably useful, requiring no further consideration. On a Monday afternoon, he went to his account manager and requested a full review of Mama Ngozi's compensation package. He sat with the numbers for an hour. She had received 1 raise in 11 years, a 5% adjustment in her 4th year that had been applied automatically across all household staff. She was paid fairly by the market standard for domestic staff in Abuja. She was not paid fairly by any other standard, not by the standard of what she contributed, not by the standard of what 11 years of loyalty and competence and daily invisible grace was worth, not even remotely. He sat with this information and felt something he had not felt in a long time. Shame. Not the performance of it, the actual thing. The specific, uncomfortable weight of a man who has discovered that his sense of himself as fair and reasonable was based on never looking closely enough to know whether it was true. He went to find her. She was in the study, dusting the shelves with the focused attention she brought to every task, the kind of attention that made even maintenance look like a form of respect. He said, "Mama Ngozi." She stopped, set down the cloth, turned. "Sir?" He said, "I want to talk to you." She waited. He said, "I went to the Gidan Beje. I watched you work." Her face did not change, but something in her stillness shifted slightly. The stillness of someone who has been holding something for a very long time and is now deciding whether the person in front of them is worth the weight of setting it down. He said, "Who are those people?" She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "People who need food." He said, "Is that all?" She considered the question. Then she said, "They are people the city forgot." He said, "How do you know them?" She looked at him with the particular expression of someone who is deciding how much truth a room can hold. She said quietly, "Because I used to be one of them." The words sat between them. Chukwuebuka looked at the woman who had made his coffee and ironed his shirts and kept his house running with silent precision for 11 years. He looked at her worn hands and her careful posture and the contained quality she carried everywhere. The quality of someone who has learned that taking up space is a privilege that has to be earned rather than assumed. And he understood that the sentence she had just said was not a small thing offered casually. It was a door she had opened. And what was behind it was 30 years of life he had never once thought to ask about. He said, "Tell me." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she sat down. Not on the chair beside the door, where she sometimes waited for instructions. On the chair across from his. The chair where his colleagues sat, where his equals sat. She sat there with her hands in her lap, and she began to speak. And Chukwuebuka Ose-Mensah, who had built his career on the ability to listen to presentations and extract the information that mattered, sat across from her and listened in a way he had never listened to anything in his life, not to an investment pitch, not to a legal argument, not to any number he had ever been shown. He listened as though the words were fragile and he was responsible for receiving them correctly. Her name, she said, was Ngozi Chidinma Okafor. She had been born in Enugu. Her father had worked in the mines. Her mother had sold akara at the market gate every morning from 4 o'clock until the last one was sold, which was usually by 7. There were 5 children. Ngozi was the third. They were not poor in the way that made the news. They were poor in the way that made decisions, that determined which child got new shoes and which got the older sibling's pair, that determined whether there was money for both the school fees and the medicine when both were needed in the same week, that determined what was possible and what remained the quiet, private grief of wanting something better and knowing the architecture of better was not yours to enter. She had come to Abuja at 19. She had come because there was a man. She said this the way women say it when the man in question is no longer someone they are protecting, with the specific, stripped-back clarity of someone who has had years to understand what happened and has decided that understanding is better than pretending. His name was Emeka. He had been charming in the way that certain men are charming when they want something from you, and have correctly identified that what you want from them is to be seen. He had told her things about the future they would build, about the life that was possible in Abuja if you were willing to work for it, about the child they were going to have, because by the time they arrived in the city, the child was already coming, already certain, already a fact she carried in her body, while he made plans she was not told about until they were already in motion. And then he was gone, not dramatically, not with a confrontation or an argument, or a scene that would have at least given the ending a shape she could point to. He was simply gone one morning in a way that made clear he had been preparing to be gone for some time. And Ngozi was 20 years old in a city that was not hers, with a body that was changing in ways she could not stop, and no one who knew her name. Chukwuebuka listened. He did not speak. She had the child, a daughter. She named her Adana. She worked whatever was available, cleaning, cooking, washing, carrying things, selling things, making things at night that she sold in the morning. She lived in one room, and then in a corner of someone else's one room, and then for a period she did not name precisely, in places that were not rooms at all. She fed Adana with the specific, savage creativity of a mother who will find a way because the alternative is not a thing she is able to consider. Adana grew. She was a good child, quiet, observant, with eyes that noticed more than they let on, which Ngozi recognized because she had the same eyes. When Adana was 4, Ngozi got a job in a household in Maitama, A good job, stable, fair, with a room included. She stayed for 6 years. She saved. She put Adana in school. She was beginning to understand that the shape of a life could be rebuilt from scratch if the rebuilding was patient enough. She was beginning to believe that the 30 years ahead of her might look different from the 10 behind. Then the family she worked for moved to London. They offered to take her. She could not take Adana to London on the terms they offered. Not easily. Not with certainty. Not in a way she was willing to accept. She stayed. She found another position. And another. And eventually, 11 years ago, she found this house, this family, this kitchen. She stopped speaking. The room was very quiet. Chukwuebuka said, "Where is Adana now?" Mama Ngozi looked at her hands. She was quiet for a moment that lasted exactly long enough for him to understand that whatever came next was not going to be easy. She said, "That is the part you need to understand." She looked up at him. "That is the door you asked me to open." But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what she said next. And what she said next would explain everything. The silver photograph, the nylon bag, the 9 years of Thursday evenings, the specific quality of silence she carried in his house every day. It would explain why she had never asked him for anything. It would explain why she had chosen to feed strangers with money she could not afford to spend, rather than trust the man who paid her to notice that she needed help. And it would explain why the truth she had been carrying for 30 years was connected, in ways neither of them had yet seen, to a decision Chukwuebuka Ose Mensah had made 3 years ago in a boardroom that had nothing to do with household staff and everything to do with the city's edges, the parts of Abuja that didn't appear in development brochures until they did. Until someone decided their poverty had become inconveniently located next to potential. She reached into her brown bag. She removed an envelope. She placed it on the table between them. She said, "I found this 6 months ago, in the records office. I had been looking for something else entirely." She looked at the envelope. "And then I found this. And I did not know what to do with it. Because the name on this document is yours. And what it says about the land where Gidan Bege stands is something that cannot be unsaid once you have heard it." Chukwuebuka looked at the envelope. His hands did not move. He said, "What is in it?" She said, "The truth about where your company is building next, and who is going to lose everything when it does." Outside, the Abuja evening was arriving. The light through the study window turned from orange to a deep, saturated gold. The kind of light that makes things visible that were always there but previously overlooked. The kind of light that arrives just before dark and seems briefly to know everything. He reached for the envelope. The envelope was not sealed. That was the first thing he noticed. It had been opened carefully, the flap folded back rather than torn, the way someone opens something they intend to read more than once. The paper inside was official. Government letterhead, the kind that carried the specific weight of documents that had been filed and stamped and registered, and therefore existed in a way that could not be argued with, only survived. Chukwuebuka removed the papers. There were 3 pages. A land allocation notice, a development approval certificate, and a displacement timeline. He read them in the order she had placed them, slowly, with the careful attention of a man who has spent 20 years reading documents and knows that the truth is usually in the language that sounds most routine. The land allocation covered a parcel in the southern district of U's extension, 4.2 hectares, allocated to Osei Group Holdings under the Urban Renewal Initiative. Development approved for a mixed-use commercial complex, office towers, retail, high-end residential. Groundbreaking scheduled for the following April. His project. His signature at the bottom of the approval certificate, clean and certain, the signature of a man who had reviewed the numbers and found them satisfactory. The 3rd page was the displacement timeline. He read it once. Then he read it again. 41 structures currently on the land. Estimated occupants, 230 people. Compulsory acquisition notices to be issued 8 weeks before groundbreaking. Relocation assistance, standard government rate, 12,000 naira per household. He knew what 12,000 naira covered. He had known when he signed. He had looked at it the way he looked at all such figures, as a line item, a compliance cost, a thing that had been calculated by someone whose job was to calculate it, and therefore required no further examination from him. 230 people. He looked up. Mama Ngozi was watching him with the specific, patient expression of someone who has been waiting for a long time for another person to see what they have been looking at and has learned not to rush the moment of arrival. He said, "Gidan Beg is on this land." She said, "Yes." He said, "The community center." She said, "And 37 other structures, families, people who have lived there for years." He was quiet. She said, "Some of them have nowhere else to go." He said nothing. She said, "The man who runs the center, Malam Haruna, he has been there for 22 years. He built it himself from nothing. He feeds people, runs literacy classes, manages a small clinic with one nurse who comes on Thursdays." She paused. "He doesn't know yet. No one does. The notices haven't gone out." Chukwuebuka set the papers down. He looked at his hands. The same hands that had signed the approval. The same hands that had shaken the government liaison's hand across a conference table after the deal was closed. A handshake that had felt like completion and now felt like something else entirely. He said, "How did you get these?" She said, "My daughter works in the urban planning department. She processes allocation documents. She found the OSE group filing 3 months ago and recognized the coordinates. She had been to Gidan Beje with me. She knew what was there." He said, "Your daughter works for the government." She said, "She has worked there for 4 years. She studied planning and development at the University of Abuja." He looked at her. She met his gaze steadily. "She is good at her work. She is very good at her work." He said, "What is her name?" She said, "Adana. Adana Okafor." Something shifted in the room. Not a sound. Not a movement. A shift in pressure, the way a room shifts when something that has been approaching for a long time finally arrives. Chukwuebuka said, "The Adana Okafor, who submitted the Minority Impact Assessment for the Northern Corridor project 2 years ago." Mama Ngozi said, "Yes." He looked at her. He said, "That report cost us 4 months and a complete redesign of the northern phase." She said, "I know." He said, "It was the most thorough impact assessment this company has ever received from the planning department." He paused. "I told my team to find out who wrote it. They said it was a junior analyst." She said, "She was, at the time." He was quiet for a long moment. He said, "She is your daughter." She said, "She is my daughter." He said, "And she has been watching what this company does." She said, "She has been watching what this company does." The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who have arrived at the same place from very different directions and are now standing together, looking at what is there. Chukwuebuka stood from his chair. He walked to the window. Outside, the Abuja night was complete. The city's lights arranged themselves across the darkness in the pattern he had looked at from this window 1,000 times, a pattern he had always found beautiful, always found confirming, the view of a man who has built something that can be seen from a height. He said, without turning, "How long have you known the land was ours?" She said, "Since Adana told me. 3 months ago." He said, "And you said nothing to me." She said, "I did not know how." She paused, "And I did not know if you would hear it." He turned from the window. He said, "Would you have told me? Eventually?" She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "That is why the envelope is on the table." He sat back down. He looked at her, really looked, for perhaps the third time in 11 years, and each time it had cost him something, and each time what it cost him had been worth paying. He said, "What do you need from me?" She said, "I need you to go there." He said, "To Giedenbege." She said, "Before the notices go out. Before Malam Haruna finds out from a government letter instead of from a person." She held his gaze. He deserves to hear it from someone who can also tell him what comes next. "What does come next?" he asked. "That depends on you." He was quiet. She said, "You are a builder, Chukwuebuka." She used his name. His actual name. Not Sir, not Mr. Ose Mensa. His name, said in a way that treated it as something that belonged to a person rather than a title that marked an authority. You build things. The question is, what kind of things you decide to build from here. He said, "The approval is already filed. The investors are committed." She said, "I know." He said, "Restructuring this project would cost months, possibly the investment entirely." She said, "I know." He said, "It could be very expensive." She said, "I know." She looked at him steadily. "Is that the answer?" He did not speak. She said quietly, "Your company built 3 towers last year, Chukwuebuka. 3, each one worth more than every building in that community combined." She was not accusing. She was stating. She said, "I am not asking you to lose money. I am asking you whether the money you would lose to do this differently is money you are actually able to lose. Because I have been in your kitchen for 11 years, and I know what this company earns." She paused. "The question is not whether you can afford to change this. The question is whether you can afford not to." He looked at her. He said, "Who are you?" She looked at him with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. Patient, certain, the expression of someone who has been waiting 11 years for this particular question. She said, "I am the woman who makes your coffee. But I am also a woman who survived things you will never have to survive, and raised a daughter on nothing, and fed 230 strangers for 9 years, and carried this envelope for 3 months, waiting for the right moment." She paused. "I am the person you forgot to see, and I am still here." The next morning, Chukwuebuka called his chief of operations at 6:30. He said, "The WOOS extension project. I need the full community impact file on my desk by 9 o'clock. Not the summary, the complete file. Every household, every structure, every name." His operations chief said, "Is something wrong with the filing?" He said, "Everything is wrong with the filing. Get it to me." He arrived at the office before anyone else. The file was on his desk by 8:45. He opened it. He read it with the same attention he had given to Mama Ngozi's words the night before. Carefully, slowly, understanding that the truth was in the details, and the details had been there all along, waiting to be read by someone who was willing to read them. 41 structures, 231 people. He had been wrong by 1. There was a child not previously counted, born 4 months ago to a young couple in the 3rd structure from the eastern boundary. The names were listed by household in the displacement timeline appendix, the appendix that no one had read, because appendices were where uncomfortable specifics went to be technically present without actually being seen. He read every name. Malam Haruna Bello, 64 years old, former teacher, Kaduna State Primary School Board, resident, 22 years, operator, Giedenbege Community Center, primary service, meals, literacy, medical referrals. He stopped at that entry and read it 3 times. Then he kept going. Hajia Ramatu Sule, 78 years old, widow, resident, 31 years, original community founder. The woman who had owned the land before the government acquired it in 1987. He stopped again. He called his legal team. He said, The acquisition history for the Wu's extension parcel. I need the full chain of title. How did the government come to hold it before the current allocation? His senior counsel said, it was a compulsory acquisition in the late 80s, part of the first urban expansion program. Why? He said, was there compensation paid to the original owners? A pause. I'd have to check the records. He said, check. He closed the file. He sat for a moment in the quiet of his office, the office that looked over the city, that smelled of polished wood and the specific quality of air that expensive buildings produce, air that has been climate-controlled and filtered and made perfect in a way that natural air never quite is. He thought about the smell of the Guidan beige corridor, cooked rice and antiseptic, and years of human need. He thought about the difference between the two smells and what the difference meant. He picked up his phone. He called Mama Ngozi. She answered on the second ring. He said, I am going this afternoon. Will you come with me? A pause. She said, yes. He said, and Adana. Can she come? Another pause. Longer this time. She said, I will ask her. They went at 4 o'clock. Chukwuebuka drove. Mama Ngozi sat in the front passenger seat with her brown bag on her lap. Adana sat in the back. She was 29, her mother's eyes in a younger face, the specific composure of someone who has spent 4 years in a government planning office, watching what happened to the communities her documents described, and has developed a controlled, professional anger about it that she does not allow to become loud, because loud anger is easily dismissed. She looked at Chukwuebuka in the rearview mirror once when they set out, and did not look away immediately. He held the gaze in the mirror for a moment. He said, thank you for the Northern Corridor report. She said, it needed to be done. He said, it cost my company 4 months. She said, it saved 40 families their homes. He said nothing. She looked away. The community center looked different in the afternoon light. Less worn, somehow. Or perhaps he was seeing it differently. Not as a structure to be assessed for clearance value, but as a thing that had been built by a person who had decided that something needed to exist and had made it exist with whatever was available. The yellow paint was still mostly gone. The sign was still hand-lettered. But the door was open, and through it came the sound of children, and the specific sound of a space being actively used, which is the sound that buildings make when they have been given a reason. Malam Haruna met them in the corridor. He was a man of 64 who wore his age the way certain people wear long experience, as something that has added to them rather than subtracted. His face had the quality of someone who has seen a great deal and has decided that witnessing is a form of service. He looked at Mama Ngozi with warmth, and at Chukwuebuka with the careful, open attention of someone who recognizes importance without being impressed by it. He said, Mama Ngozi, you brought visitors, she said. Malam, this is Chukwuebuka Ose Mensa. He needs to talk with you. Malam Haruna looked at him. He said, I know the name. He said it without hostility, which was in some ways harder to receive. He said it as a fact. He gestured toward a room off the corridor, a small office with 2 chairs and a table with a thermos on it. Please sit. They sat. Chukwuebuka said, I am going to tell you something directly because you deserve to hear it directly, and not from a government notice. He placed the allocation document on the table. This land has been allocated to my company for development. Notices of compulsory acquisition are scheduled to go out in 6 weeks. Malam Haruna looked at the document. He did not touch it. He looked at it for a long moment, and then he looked at Chukwuebuka with an expression that was not what Chukwuebuka had expected. It was not shock. It was not anger. It was a specific, exhausted recognition. The expression of a man who has spent 22 years building something in a city that has always seen the land he built it on as available, and who has always known that eventually the city would come for it, and who has simply been waiting to find out in what form it would arrive. He said, "How long have we got?" Chukwebuka said, "That is what I came to discuss." Malam Haruna looked at him. He said, "You own half the towers on that side of the city." He said it without judgment, as a fact. "What do you want to discuss?" Chukwebuka said, "I want to understand what is here before I decide what happens to it." Malam Haruna was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why?" Chukwebuka looked at Mama Ngozi. She was sitting beside him, hands folded in her lap, watching him with the patient, certain expression she had been wearing since the night of the photograph. He said, "Because someone showed me the difference between seeing a place and understanding one." Malam Haruna looked at Mama Ngozi. Something passed between them. The specific communication of people who have known each other long enough to have a private language. He looked back at Chukwebuka. He said, "You want a tour?" He said, "Yes." The tour took 2 hours. Every room, every person. Malam Haruna introduced Chukwebuka by name, not as a developer, not as a businessman, not as a threat. As a visitor who was trying to understand something. The people they met received this introduction with varying degrees of openness, and Chukwebuka received all of it, the warmth and the wariness both, as the appropriate response of people who have learned that the intentions of powerful visitors require demonstration before they warrant trust. The old woman who had been on the land for 31 years. Hajia Ramatu, who had once owned it and had received 8,000 naira in 1987 as compensation for land her family had farmed for 3 generations. He sat with her. He did not perform listening. He listened. She was 81, and her voice was the voice of someone who has long since passed through anger and arrived at the other side of it. A country called clarity, where things are simply what they are, and pretending otherwise costs more than it's worth. She said, every few years someone comes and says they are going to build something. They built the road in '93. They built the drainage in 2001. She looked at him. Nobody asked us what we needed. They just built what suited them and told us to be grateful. He said, "What do you need?" She looked at him for a long moment. The same look Mama Ngozi had given him. The look of someone deciding whether the question was genuine or decorative. Then she said, "To stay." That was all. Just that. To stay. He looked at the faces in that building. The teenage boy who had come back for a second plate, who was there again that afternoon, helping stack chairs with the focused energy of someone who has been given a reason to show up. The young mother whose face had done the complicated thing that ended in relief. The elderly man with the cane whose name, Chukwebuka now knew, was Babasul, Hajia Ramatu's brother, 83 years old, who had been born on this land and had never lived anywhere else. He looked at all of them, and he understood something that no spreadsheet had ever told him, and no impact assessment had ever found a column for. These people were not occupants of land. They were a community. And communities, once destroyed, did not reassemble elsewhere. They simply ceased to exist. The drive back was quiet. Adana sat in the back with her arms folded and looked out the window. Mama Ngozi looked at the road. Chukwebuka drove. At a traffic light near the Maitama junction, Adana said, "What are you going to do?" He said, "I don't know yet." She said, "That's not good enough." He looked in the rearview mirror. She was looking back. She said, "The notices go out in 6 weeks. After that, the legal process moves quickly. If you want to change something, you have to move before the notices." He said, "I know." She said, "So I'm asking again. What are you going to do?" He said, "I'm going to call an emergency board meeting tomorrow morning." She looked at him. He said, "And I'm going to propose a full redesign of the WU's extension project." She was quiet. He said, The compulsory acquisition will be withdrawn. We will negotiate directly with the community, she said. They can't afford to negotiate. He said, I'm not going to ask them to pay anything. She was still looking at him. He said, there are ways to build on land without erasing what's already there. Ways I have not been using because they are slower and more expensive, and I have always prioritized speed and margin. He paused. I'm going to stop prioritizing that. Adana held his gaze in the mirror for a long moment. She said, I'll believe it when I see it. He said, good. That's the correct response. The board meeting lasted 4 hours. He presented first, not the redesign proposal, but the files, the names. Hajia Ramatu's 8,000 naira in 1987. The family that had farmed that land for 3 generations. Baba Sule, 83, born on the land, never left. The community center with its meals and its literacy classes and its Thursday nurse. He did not editorialize. He presented. He let the facts do what facts do when they are given space. They became undeniable. His financial director said, the redesign will cost at minimum 4 additional months. The investors will need to be managed carefully. He said, I'll manage them personally. His legal director said, withdrawing the compulsory acquisition application will require a formal submission to the ministry. It can be done, but it will attract attention. He said, good. Let it attract attention. Someone asked, what exactly are you proposing instead? He said, a community-integrated development. The center stays. 41 structures. We build around them where possible. We offer genuine relocation with return rights where not. We include affordable housing in the development mix. We employ locally during construction. We give Gidan Bej a permanent building in the new complex. The room was quiet. He said, this project will take longer and earn less in the first 3 years. He looked around the table. But we will build something that doesn't require us to pretend we don't know who was there before us. And this company will be able to look at what it built without having to avoid the details. One board member said, Andrew, this is... He stopped. Chukwebuka looked at him. You mean Chukwebuka? He said quietly. The board member blinked. Apologized. He had been calling him Andrew for 7 years. It was shorter, more international. Easier to say in rooms like this. Chukwebuka had never corrected him. He said, my name is Chukwebuka. It means God is great. My mother named me with care. He paused. I'm going to start asking that it be used correctly. The vote was 5-2 in favor. It was enough. The notices never went out. Instead, a letter went to Malam Haruna from Ose Group, on company letterhead, signed by Chukwebuka personally, written without legal language, stating in plain terms what had been planned and what had been changed and why. He asked for a meeting. He asked for the community's direct participation in the redesign process. He asked specifically for Hajia Ramatu's involvement, because she had been on that land the longest, and her knowledge of what it needed was irreplaceable. Malam Haruna called within the hour. He said, I've read the letter 3 times. Chukwebuka said, and? Malam Haruna said, the community will meet with you. He paused, but Mama Ngozi comes. He said she was going to come regardless. The first community meeting was held in the Gidan Bege main room. 40 people. Chukwebuka sat at one of the folding tables, not at the front of the room, not behind a presentation screen, at the table, among the people. Mama Ngozi sat beside him. Adana sat on his other side with a notebook, not as a government official, but as herself, as Mama Ngozi's daughter, which in this room meant something specific and earned. Malam Haruna facilitated. He asked people to speak, and people spoke. And Chukwebuka listened with the full, specific, costly attention of someone who understands that he is hearing things he cannot afford to have filtered before they reach him. Hajia Ramatu spoke for 12 minutes without stopping. She spoke about the land and her family and the 8,000 naira and the 31 years since. She did not shout. She did not demand. She spoke with the absolute authority of someone who is simply describing what happened, and what happened was enough. When she finished, Chukwuebuka said, "The 8,000 naira from 1987. We have a figure for what that land was worth at current valuation." He placed a document on the table. "This is what we believe fair restitution looks like." She looked at the document. She did not speak immediately. Then she said, "This is for the land my father farmed." He said, "Yes." She said, "His name was Ibrahim Musa Sule." He said, "Your name will be on the restitution documents. His name will be in the community record we are creating for this development. Every original family. Every name." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Why are you doing this?" He said, "Because Mama Ngozi showed me what I was not seeing." She looked at Mama Ngozi. Mama Ngozi looked at the table with the expression of someone who is not interested in credit and is quietly, privately satisfied by something much more important than credit. The development took 19 months. The Gidenbege Center did not close for a single week during construction. Malam Haruna had insisted on this, and Chukwuebuka had built the construction timeline around it, which cost him 8 weeks, and he did not complain about the 8 weeks. On every Thursday during those 19 months, he came to the center. He served food. He learned names. He made mistakes. He mispronounced Haji Aramatu's name for 3 weeks before she corrected him, which she did with the same patient certainty with which she did everything. And he thanked her for it without embarrassment, because he had learned that embarrassment was a luxury that prevented correction. And correction was the only thing that led to doing better. Adana joined Ose Group in the 8th month. Not in a junior role. As Director of Community Impact, a position Chukwuebuka created with her input on what the position should actually require, which was unusual and uncomfortable for the board and absolutely necessary. She brought the same methodical, uncompromising attention to the role that she had brought to her government work. And the projects she reviewed and the reports she filed changed the way the company made decisions in ways that were permanent. She did not soften things that needed to be said. Chukwuebuka did not ask her to. Mama Ngozi did not change her title, he offered. She declined. She said, "I am fine as I am." He said, "You're not an employee anymore. She said, "I am a woman who makes your coffee and goes to Gidenbege on Thursdays, and is your daughter's mother." She paused. "I don't need a title for any of those things." He said, "Your salary." She said, "My salary was adjusted already." She said it simply, without pointed emphasis, the way she said things that were pointed. He had adjusted it retroactively for the 11 years. He had said nothing about it when he did it, and she had said nothing when the number appeared in her account. They both knew what it meant, and neither of them required the other to say it. The development opened on a Saturday. Not with a press event, with a gathering. Tables outside, food, music from a speaker someone's nephew had set up. The new buildings rose behind Gidenbege, glass and concrete, and the specific quality of new construction, but built around the center rather than over it, so that from a certain angle you could see both at once. The new rising and the old remaining, which was not an accident of planning, but the central architectural intention of the whole project, because some things should be visible together. Chukwuebuka stood at the edge of the gathering and looked at it. Malam Haruna came to stand beside him. He said, "You did it." Chukwuebuka said, "We did it." Malam Haruna smiled. He said, "Your grandfather would have liked this." Chukwuebuka looked at him. He said, "You knew my grandfather?" Malam Haruna said, "I grew up in Enugu. Your grandfather built the community library in our neighborhood in 1978. He did it with his own money and no government support, and he hired local labor, and he attended the opening in the same clothes he wore to work. He said it was the best money he had ever spent. He paused. I recognized the name Osei Mensa when the allocation notice came through. I wondered what had happened to what he built, what this company had become. He looked at Chukwuebuka steadily. Now I think I see. Chukwuebuka was quiet for a long moment. He said, I didn't know about the library. Malam Haruna said, Then you should find out. Some things are worth knowing about the people who made you. Mama Ngozi appeared at his shoulder. She handed him a plate of food, jollof rice, fried plantain, the same things she had served the first night he had stood in the doorway and watched her be completely herself. She said, Eat. He took the plate. He said, Thank you. She looked at him with the expression she had been wearing since the night of the photograph, patient, certain, no longer containing anything that needed containing. She said, You are welcome. And this time, the words meant something different from what they had meant in 11 years of mornings. They meant exactly what they said. He ate. Around him, Abuja continued its enormous, alive business, the generators and the traffic and the sound of a city that does not pause for anyone's reckoning. But in this small, specific corner of it, something had been built that was not a monument to anyone's wealth. Something that had been built by starting with the names, by asking what was already there before deciding what to put in its place, by learning, slowly and at real cost, the difference between building for people and building with them. Adana was across the courtyard, talking to a group of young people from the community employment program. Her hands moved when she talked. She had her mother's eyes. Baba Sule sat on a chair near the Gidan Bege entrance, face turned toward the afternoon sun with his eyes closed. A man 83 years old, sitting on land where he had been born, listening to the sound of his community still existing. Hajia Ramatu stood near the new community garden, her idea, her design, built on the eastern face of the new building where it would get the best morning light, planted with things she had chosen. She saw Chukwuebuka looking, and nodded once. He nodded back. He went to find Mama Ngozi. She was inside the Gidan Bege, in the kitchen, washing dishes. He stood in the doorway, the same doorway where he had stood on the first night and seen her happiness, and not understood what he was seeing. He said, You knew it would come to this. She kept washing. She said, I hoped. He said, You carried that envelope for 3 months, waiting for the right moment. She said, I was waiting to see whether you were the kind of person who could hear it. He said, How did you know I was? She turned from the sink and looked at him with the expression he had now seen, enough times to understand was not patience exactly. It was something more like faith. The specific, earned faith of someone who has looked at a person for a long time and decided, against the available evidence, that there was something worth believing in. She said, I raised you, not as a mother, but I have watched you since you were 31 years old, and I saw things in you that you did not show anyone. She dried her hands. Small things. The way you double-checked the security guard's hours when you thought he was being underpaid. The way you kept your grandfather's photograph on your desk and sometimes looked at it when you thought no one was watching. She looked at him steadily. You were not a bad person, Chukwuebuka. You were an inattentive one. And inattention can be cured. Badness is harder. He looked at her. He said, I'm sorry. For 11 years. She said, I know. He said, for not asking your name. She said, Ngozi Chidinma Okafor. She said it clearly, completely, the way you say a name when you want someone to actually hear it. He said, Ngozi Chidinma Okafor. He said it back. She nodded. He said, I will not forget it. She said, I know you won't. She picked up her cloth and went back to wiping down the counter. He stood in the doorway a moment longer. He said, Ngozi. She said, yes. He said, thank you. She said without turning, you're welcome. Go eat your food before it gets cold." He went. Outside, the gathering continued. The music played. The children ran. The new buildings caught the late afternoon light and held it, golden and warm, the kind of light that makes even new things look as though they have been there long enough to be trusted. And somewhere in the crowd, the old and the new were simply present together, not in resolution of everything that had come before, but in the specific, possible, daily work of choosing to do better than you did yesterday, which is the only form of justice that is both honest and durable. If this story stayed with you, if you felt the weight of what it means to see someone for the first time after years of looking through them, subscribe to Tales of Tears African and ring the bell. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that it is never too late to ask the question you should have asked a long time ago. Leave a comment telling us the moment in this story that hit you hardest. We read every one. We are here every week with the next story, which begins, as all the best ones do, with someone who has been carrying something alone for far too long, and someone who is finally ready to help carry it.